In the harsh winter of 1881, deep in the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory, the settlement of South Pass City watched with open mockery as a young orphan named Isaac Coleman stacked stones into what they called his Fool's Tower. The air that December was cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, and every homesteader knew one truth about surviving winter. You built a log cabin with a stone fireplace, chinked the gaps with mud, and burned wood from sunup to sundown. Anything else was madness. But Isaac Coleman, barely 23 and alone since his parents died of mountain fever 2 years prior, had seen something in the ancient stone formations scattered across the high country that made him question everything the old-timers swore by. His nearest neighbor, Marcus Flynn, lived about 3 miles down valley. Beyond that, the settlement sat another 5 miles east, maybe 15 families clinging to what remained after the gold played out. Isaac had come west with his family in '79, his father chasing silver strikes that never materialized. They'd filed a claim in a high valley where the wind never stopped, where winter came in September and stayed until May. His mother lasted 1 winter before consumption took her. His father made it through the next, but grief and cold wore him down. By spring of '81, Isaac was alone with land, tools, and growing certainty that everyone built their homes wrong. That summer, he'd worked in South Pass City hauling timber, and every night he'd return to his father's cabin and feel cold seeping through the walls like water through a sieve. The logs were thick lodgepole pine, fitted tight, but come January, the frost found every gap, every seam where chinking had cracked. He'd seen families burning through a cord of wood every few days just to stay alive, seen children huddled by the hearth while the far corners might as well have been outdoors. The cabins leaked heat no matter how much mud and moss you stuffed in the gaps. But Isaac had spent time in the high country that summer, sheltering in the lee of massive granite outcrops during storms. He'd noticed something. Stone walls held a different kind of cold, a stillness that didn't bite like cabin walls did. When he pressed his hand against sun-warmed granite, the heat seemed to sink in and stay, radiating back long after the sun moved on. The native peoples had built with stone when they could, and though their structures had mostly fallen to ruin, Isaac had found walls still standing solid after countless winters. The idea came slowly. A tower of stone, small and compact, with walls thick enough to hold warmth through the night and shed the wind. He tried explaining it to Flynn one August evening. He talked about how stone held heat the way wood never could, how a circular structure shed wind better than square corners, how smaller space meant less air to warm. Flynn listened with the patient expression of a man humoring a fool, then shook his head. "Boy, you're thinking too much and knowing too little. A man builds with what works. Stones for foundations and chimneys. You start getting fancy with your notions, winter'll kill you for your trouble." The words stung, but they didn't change Isaac's mind. By September, when he should have been cutting timber, he was hauling stones from a collapsed cliff face about a mile up valley, dragging them back 1 load at a time. The mockery started immediately. Flynn rode by one afternoon and just watched Isaac wrestle with a boulder the size of a wash basin, then rode away, shaking his head. When Isaac went to town for supplies, the men asked outright if he'd lost his mind. An old-timer named Silas Crawford told him flat out he'd be dead by Christmas. "Stone draws the cold," Crawford said with absolute certainty. "It'll freeze you solid. Every miner knows you don't winter in stone." Isaac tried to explain about thickness and heat retention, but Crawford walked away mid-sentence. The rest laughed openly, and Isaac left town determined to prove them wrong, even if part of him wondered if they might be right. Through September and October, Isaac worked alone from first light to last, laying stone in concentric circles that rose slowly from frozen ground. He'd chosen a spot on a slight rise where wind would hit equally from all sides, no corners to catch the gusts. The tower would be 12 feet across inside, with walls a full 3 feet thick at the base, tapering as they rose. He had no proper mortar, just clay and gravel from a stream bed, but he'd watched masons in the city and understood the key was in the fitting, choosing each rock for shape and weight, making them lock together like puzzle pieces. Each stone had to be selected, tested, adjusted, sometimes carried back to the pile. His hands grew split from handling cold rock, his back aching from endless bending and lifting. The work was harder than any logging because every stone was different, every placement a problem to solve. The tower grew slowly, inch by inch, ring by ring, while aspens turned gold and lost their leaves, while first snows dusted the peaks, and crept into the valleys. By late October, the walls stood taller than a man, and Isaac worked on scaffolding cobbled from scrap lumber. Neighbors who bothered to ride by didn't even pretend to understand. Margaret Flynn came once with bread and dried venison, her face full of pity. "Isaac, honey, winter's coming hard. You can't live in that thing. Come stay with us until spring, then maybe build a proper place." He thanked her and said he'd be fine. The tower kept rising. He built a domed roof from progressively smaller stones, each layer cantilevered inward until the gap at top was narrow enough to cap with a single flat stone. He left a small opening for smoke and fashioned a wooden door that fit snug into the southern face, the only break in the stone circle. Inside, he built a small fire pit in the center, lined with flat stones to absorb and radiate heat. He carved shallow niches into the interior walls for storage and built a simple sleeping platform from planks raised off the floor. The mockery crystallized into specific phrases. Coleman's Ice House, they called it, or the Orphan's Tomb. Silas Crawford made a show of asking if Isaac wanted a spot saved in the cemetery. A young miner named Pete Garson started jokes about finding Isaac frozen solid come spring. The jokes had an edge, a meanness born from the frontier's intolerance for those who didn't follow proven paths. These were men who'd lost neighbors to winter, who'd seen families freeze when woodpiles ran out or chimneys caught fire, and they had no patience for experimentation when stakes were survival itself. To them, Isaac was spitting in the face of hard-won wisdom. Isaac finished the tower before the first major snow, and by mid-November, he'd moved inside. The space was tight, just enough room for his sleeping platform, provisions in the wall niches, and the fire pit in the center. It felt more like a cave than a house, dark and close and surprisingly quiet. The thick walls muffled the howling wind outside, turning constant roar into distant whisper. He kept the fire small, burning only what he needed for cooking and evening warmth, and immediately noticed the heat didn't vanish like in the cabin. The stones around the fire pit grew warm and stayed warm, radiating back hours after the flames died. The walls seemed to breathe, slowly absorbing warmth when sun struck them and releasing it through long nights. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, a steadiness the drafty cabin never had. When Flynn stopped by late November bringing news and venison, Isaac invited him inside. Outside, the wind was cutting and cruel, cold enough to water your eyes and ache your lungs. Inside the tower, with just a modest fire, the temperature was almost comfortable, warm enough to sit without a coat. Flynn didn't say much, just stood running his hand along the interior wall, feeling the stone's warmth. "It's different," he said finally, grudgingly. "Don't know if it'll hold when winter really sets in, but it's different." Isaac knew that was as close to approval as he'd get, and he took it as a small victory. But Flynn was right to be cautious, because the real test hadn't come yet. The explanation for why the tower worked was simple enough, though Isaac didn't think in scientific terms. The thick stone walls were like a massive coat wrapped around the living space, not just blocking wind, but actually holding warmth the way a stone holds sun's heat after sunset. The circular shape meant no corners for wind to catch and pry at, no weak points where cold could concentrate. The small size meant less air to heat and less area for heat to escape. The fire pit in the center radiated warmth in all directions rather than most going up a chimney, and the stones around it absorbed that heat and gave it back slowly through the night. It was like how a root cellar stays cool in summer, Isaac would have said, or how a spring stays cold on the hottest day. The earth and stone had their own temperature, their own steadiness, and if you built with enough around you, that steadiness worked in your favor. The tower wasn't fighting winter the way a log cabin did, trying to keep cold out through endless burning and hoping gaps didn't grow too wide. The tower was holding warmth the way the earth itself held warmth, patient and steady and unmoved by wind's fury. December came mild that year with snow but without killing cold, and Isaac settled into winter routine. He'd wake before dawn to rebuild the fire, eat simple breakfast of cornmeal or salt pork, then spend days maintaining his woodpile, checking traps, or working inside by candlelight. He used far less wood than expected, maybe a third of what his father's cabin had consumed, and the tower stayed comfortable, even when temperature outside never rose above freezing. By Christmas, he was confident in his design, but he also knew confidence without testing was just pride, and winter in the high country humbled proud men. The real test came in January, announced first by the ravens and magpies going silent, then by a pale yellow cast in the sky that old-timers called a snowlight. Flynn rode up on January 3rd with a warning Isaac could hear in the tightness of his voice. "Weather's changing," Flynn said, looking at the northwestern horizon. "My bones ache and the birds are all wrong. My grandfather lived through the winter of '46 back in the Dakotas, told me about a cold that made this country feel warm. I don't know if that's what's coming, but something is. You've got time to pack up and ride to town if you want. Margaret and I would take you in, or Crawford's got room in his stable loft. Nobody'll think less of you for being sensible." Isaac thanked him but said he'd stay, and Flynn nodded slowly, his expression between respect and resignation. "Well, if you're determined, make sure you've got enough wood. What's coming? It's not the kind of cold you play games with." That night, the temperature began to fall in a way Isaac had never experienced. It didn't just get cold. It got cold and kept getting colder, steadily, relentlessly, like something alive was drinking warmth out of the world. By next morning, his water bucket had frozen solid, despite being inside near the fire pit. When he stepped outside, the air hurt to breathe, each inhalation like swallowing broken glass, and his exposed skin began aching within seconds. The cold that settled over Wind River Valley in January of 1882 was the kind old-timers would talk about for the rest of their lives, the kind that became a benchmark for all future winters. It dropped and held week after week, until breath froze in the air and fell as tiny ice crystals, until smoke from chimneys seemed to freeze into solid columns, until the very trees groaned and cracked. The world turned brittle and hostile. In South Pass City, families burned through wood piles twice as fast as planned, and men took shifts through the night keeping fires going just to keep interior temperature above freezing. Children slept bundled in every piece of clothing, huddled under piles of blankets and furs, and still woke to frost on cabin walls. The gaps in log cabins that had seemed minor in November became gaping vulnerabilities in January. Chinking fell out as wood contracted, and no amount of stuffing rags and moss could stop cold from seeping in. People burned furniture when wood piles ran low, burned fences, burned anything that would burn, and the smoke from desperate fires hung over the settlement like permanent fog. Inside his stone tower, Isaac experienced the cold differently. He could hear it howling outside, could see it in frost patterns on his small window, could feel it trying to find a way in. But the thick walls stood between him and the worst of it, a barrier that didn't crack or shift or leak like wood did. He kept his fire going day and night, but it didn't have to be large, just steady, and the stones around the fire pit absorbed that heat and radiated it back so effectively that he could sleep through the night without the fire dying completely. The tower's interior stayed bearable, not warm but livable, survivable, while outside the temperature dropped to levels that killed exposed flesh in minutes. He used maybe a quarter of the wood he'd laid by, burning it slowly while his neighbors desperately rationed dwindling supplies. Through his window he could see smoke pouring from Flynn's chimney a few miles down valley, a constant stream that spoke of fires being fed around the clock. He knew what that meant in terms of labor and resources, knew Flynn and his wife were probably sleeping in shifts, knew they were burning through wood at an unsustainable rate. By the third week of January, the situation had become desperate. Flynn's woodpile, which should have lasted until March, was nearly gone, and he'd started burning green wood that barely caught and produced more smoke than heat. The temperature had dropped so low that his cabin, despite fires in both hearth and cooking stove, never got warm enough to melt ice that formed on the water bucket overnight. His wife Margaret had developed a cough that wouldn't clear, the kind that came from breathing cold air day and night, and their two young children were constantly cold, their lips tinged blue even when huddled by the fire. Flynn had pride, the kind frontier men wore like armor, but he also had a wife and children who were suffering, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. On January 22nd, in the middle of what would later be recorded as the coldest day in the territory's history, Flynn hitched his wagon and drove his family up to Isaac's tower, his face tight with the kind of humiliation that comes from admitting you were wrong when lives are on the line. Isaac saw them coming and met them at the door. He didn't say a word about being right or about the mockery he'd endured. He just helped Margaret down from the wagon, her body shaking so hard she could barely stand, and ushered the family inside while Flynn brought in essential provisions. The contrast was immediate and visceral. Outside, the cold was a physical presence, a crushing weight that made every movement difficult. The wagon's wooden seat had frost on it, despite Flynn sitting there the entire ride. The horses' breath froze into icicles on their bits. But inside the tower, with the fire built up and thick stone walls holding every bit of heat, the temperature was almost comfortable. Warm enough that Margaret stopped shaking within minutes. Warm enough that the children stopped crying and started looking around with wonder in their eyes. Flynn stood in the center of that small round room, his hands held out to the fire, and Isaac watched understanding settle over the older man, like a weight. "How much wood have you burnt?" Flynn asked finally, his voice rough. Isaac gestured to the modest pile in the corner, less than a cord, maybe half, what Flynn had burned in just the past 3 weeks. "About that much since November," Isaac said quietly. "The walls hold the heat. The fire doesn't have to do all the work." Flynn was quiet for a long time, staring at the stone walls that surrounded them, his calloused hands running over the carefully fitted rocks. "We all thought you were a fool," he said finally, and there was no mockery in his voice now, just flat acknowledgement of a man proven catastrophically wrong. "Every one of us said you'd be dead by Christmas. I told my wife you were too stubborn to listen to reason, and here you are sitting comfortable while the rest of us are freezing to death in our so-called proper cabins." He paused, then added something Isaac would remember for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry. I should have listened. Should have helped instead of laughed. You saw something we all missed, and I'm sorry for being too blind to see it." Isaac told him there was no shame in not knowing, that he'd only figured it out through observation and luck. But Flynn shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "There's shame in refusing to see what's right in front of you because it doesn't match what you've always believed. You tried to tell me in August. I chose not to listen." That night, with Flynn's family sleeping warm for the first time in weeks, Isaac and Flynn sat by the fire talking in low voices about the tower's design, about the principles that made it work, about how Flynn could modify his cabin or build something similar come spring. The cold outside was still murderous, but inside the tower it felt distant and manageable, and for the first time since the freeze had started, there was a sense of hope. The brutal cold lasted 6 weeks, finally breaking in early March, and by the time it ended, Isaac's tower had become something of a legend in the valley. Flynn had returned to his cabin after 4 days, taking with him detailed observations about the tower's construction and new understanding of how stone could work with winter, rather than simply fighting it. He survived on the last of his wood, and the memory of those 4 warm nights, and when spring came he was the first to begin quarrying stone from the same cliff face Isaac had used. Within 2 years, 3 more families in the valley had built smaller versions of Isaac's tower, and while none matched his original in efficiency, they all performed better than the log cabins they replaced. The settlement began to change, slowly but noticeably, as the lesson Isaac had demonstrated spread through practical experience. Those who'd mocked him loudest became his most ardent students. Isaac's original tower stood for more than 40 years, housing first Isaac himself through his bachelor years, then briefly serving as a smokehouse after he married and built a larger home down valley, and finally providing shelter for a succession of hired hands and seasonal workers who all remarked on how little wood it required, even in the deepest winter. The technique he'd pioneered never became widespread beyond the immediate area, but in that one valley in Wyoming territory, the sight of compact stone towers became common enough that travelers would ask about them, and locals would tell the story of the orphan who'd been laughed at for building what everyone said was a tomb, but proved to be a fortress against winter's worst fury. The tower itself finally collapsed in a spring flood in 1923, the foundation undercut by unusually violent runoff. But by then, it had served its purpose many times over. The story of Isaac Coleman and his stone tower is about more than just engineering or survival technique. It's about the courage it takes to see past conventional wisdom when your observations tell you there's a better way, and it's about the strength required to persist when everyone around you is certain you're wrong. Isaac wasn't a scholar or an engineer. He was an orphaned young man trying to survive in a hostile environment, but he paid attention to what the land was showing him, and he trusted his own observations even when experienced men mocked him for it. The frontier was full of men like Isaac, men who had to solve impossible problems with limited resources and no formal training, and their solutions often came from careful observation rather than book learning. They watched how animals sheltered, how the land itself responded to extremes of weather, how ancient peoples had built centuries before. They learned through trial and error, through success and failure, and occasionally through insights that seemed obvious in hindsight, but revolutionary in the moment. The broader truth that Isaac's story illustrates applies far beyond frontier architecture. Innovation often looks like folly until it's proven, and those who push past conventional wisdom are almost always ridiculed before they're respected. Every community develops its own body of accepted knowledge, its own sense of what works, and that knowledge is valuable because it's been tested through experience. But that same knowledge can also become a prison, preventing people from seeing alternatives that might work better. The challenge is knowing when to trust tradition and when to question it, and that requires both humility about what you don't know and confidence in what you observe. Isaac had both. He didn't dismiss the experience of the old-timers out of hand. He genuinely tried to understand why they built the way they did, but he also trusted his own eyes and reasoning, and when the two came into conflict, he chose to test his theory rather than automatically defaulting to tradition. That willingness to test, to try, to risk being wrong in pursuit of being right is what separates those who advance human knowledge from those who simply maintain it. There's also something deeply human in how Isaac's vindication came not through argument, but through lived experience. He couldn't convince his neighbors with words because their certainty was too deep, too rooted in their own survival. What changed their minds was the inescapable reality of that 6-week freeze, the visceral experience of feeling warmth in Isaac's tower after days of shivering in their own homes. Truth, particularly practical truth about survival, has a way of cutting through argument and pride when conditions become extreme enough. Flynn's apology in that tower wasn't just about admitting he was wrong. It was about recognizing that his certainty had nearly cost his family their lives. These lessons remain relevant because human nature doesn't change, and every generation faces the same fundamental challenge of balancing tradition with innovation, respecting experience while remaining open to new ideas. The men and women who settled the American frontier faced challenges most of us can barely imagine today. They lived in a world where a mistake in planning could mean death, where there was no safety net, no emergency services, no easy solutions. They had to be constantly vigilant, constantly adapting, constantly solving problems with whatever resources they could scrape together. What makes their stories worth preserving isn't just historical curiosity or nostalgia. It's the reminder that human beings are capable of remarkable ingenuity when circumstances demand it. Isaac Coleman wasn't exceptional in his intelligence or education. He was exceptional in his willingness to observe carefully, think independently, and act on his convictions even when everyone told him he was wrong. That kind of thinking, that kind of courage, is what allowed our ancestors to survive and eventually thrive in conditions that should have killed them, and it's a quality we still need today, even though the specific challenges have changed. If stories like Isaac Coleman's resonate with you, if you find yourself drawn to these accounts of practical wisdom and human resilience, then you're part of a community that believes these lessons matter, that history isn't just dates and names, but a living resource of hard-won knowledge. By subscribing to this channel, you're helping preserve these stories, keeping alive the memory of men and women who solved impossible problems with limited resources and unlimited determination. A like or a share extends the reach of these stories to others who might find value in them, and your comments often reveal similar stories from your own family histories, creating a growing archive of frontier wisdom that might otherwise be lost. We have dozens more stories waiting, accounts of innovation and survival from across the American frontier, each one offering its own lessons about human ingenuity and persistence. Your engagement isn't just support for a channel. It's participation in preserving a part of history that deserves to be remembered, a recognition that the wisdom of the past still has something to teach us. Share your own family stories in the comments if you have them. These narratives belong to all of us, and keeping them alive is a collective responsibility. In the end, what matters most about Isaac Coleman's stone tower isn't the specific design or even the survival it enabled. What matters is what it represents. The idea that one person, armed with nothing but careful observation and the courage to act on what they've learned, can create something that changes their world and the lives of everyone around them. Isaac built more than a structure to keep out the cold. He built proof that questioning convention isn't foolishness, but sometimes the highest form of wisdom. And he left a legacy that echoes far beyond one small valley in Wyoming territory.